I wasn't looking for love, but the moment she walked into my life, everything I believed about timing, age, and destiny was shattered in a single heartbeat. I still remember that day like it was written in the stars long before I ever lived it. It wasn't supposed to be special. It was just another ordinary moment in an ordinary life, until she walked in. There was nothing loud about her entrance, no dramatic music, no grand scene. Just a quiet presence that somehow silenced everything around me. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't expect. We started talking the way strangers do, carefully, politely, almost as if we were both afraid to say too much. But somewhere between the first smile and the second sentence, it stopped feeling like we were strangers. It felt familiar, like I had known her before, in a life I couldn't remember. And then came the moment that changed everything. Her age. It hit me like a sudden storm. Not because it mattered to my heart, but because I knew it would matter to the world. Numbers have a strange way of controlling people's thoughts, don't they? They create boundaries where feelings don't exist. They build walls around something that was meant to be free. I remember going quiet for a moment. Not because I felt different about her, but because I was thinking about everything else. Society, judgment, opinions, all the voices that hadn't even spoken yet, but I could already hear them. But then she smiled again. And in that smile, I realized something powerful. My heart didn't hesitate. It didn't calculate. It didn't question. It didn't care about numbers, timelines, or expectations. It simply chose her. And that scared me. Because falling in love isn't always about joy. Sometimes it's about courage. Sometimes it's about standing in front of everything the world believes, and choosing your own truth instead. We kept talking. Days turned into nights, and conversations turned into something deeper. I started noticing the little things, the way she laughed when she forgot to be serious, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about her dreams, the way she listened, really listened, like every word I said mattered. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just curiosity. It was connection. The kind that doesn't come often. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that just happens, and once it does, there's no going back to who you were before. But love like this doesn't come without a price. There were moments when doubt tried to creep in. Late nights where I questioned everything. What will people say? Is this right? Will this last? Questions that didn't come from my heart, but from fear. And fear is loud. It tries to convince you that what you feel isn't enough. That love needs approval. That happiness should fit into a box that others understand. But every time I looked at her, all that noise faded away. Because what we had wasn't complicated. It was simple. We laughed together. We understood each other. We brought peace into each other's chaos. And in a world where everything feels temporary, what we had felt real. And real is rare. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when we were sitting together in silence. Not the awkward kind, the comfortable kind, the kind where words aren't needed because presence is enough. And I realized something. Love doesn't ask for perfect timing. It doesn't check your age. It doesn't follow rules written by strangers. It just shows up. And when it does, you have two choices. You can walk away because it doesn't fit the world's expectations. Or you can hold on because it feels right in your soul. I chose to hold on. Not because it was easy. Not because it made sense to everyone. But because, for the first time in a long time, my heart felt certain. And certainty in love is something you don't ignore. People will always have something to say. They will question what they don't understand. They will measure your happiness using their own limitations. But they don't feel what you feel. They don't see what you see when you look into her eyes. They don't hear the silence that speaks louder than words when you're together. They don't live your story. You do. And this is my story. A story that began with an unexpected meeting. That was shaken by a simple number. But strengthened by something far more powerful than age. Love. Not the kind you read about. Not the kind that fades when things get difficult. But the kind that grows, quietly, deeply, and without permission. She walked into my life, and yes, her age shocked me. But what shocked me even more, was how effortlessly she became a part of my heart. And if I had to choose again, between what the world expects and what my heart knows, I would choose her. Every single time. It was one of those ordinary days that carry no promise of change, the kind of day where everything feels routine and predictable. I wasn't searching for anything new, not expecting a story to begin, not even aware that my life was about to take a turn I could never have imagined. The world around me moved as it always did, people passing by, voices blending into the background, time slipping quietly from one moment to the next. And then, without warning, she walked in. There was nothing overly dramatic about it, no sudden pause in time, no obvious sign that something extraordinary had just happened. Yet somehow, everything felt different. It was as if the air shifted, like a subtle change you can't quite explain but you feel it deeply. My attention, without permission, was drawn to her presence. Not just the way she looked, but something beyond that, something calm, something quietly captivating. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and maybe that's what made it impossible not to notice her. For a brief moment, our worlds existed separately, just two strangers occupying the same space. But then came that small, almost insignificant exchange, a glance that lasted just a second longer than usual. And in that second, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, just a quiet recognition, like two stories brushing against each other for the very first time. We started talking in the simplest way possible. Nothing special, nothing rehearsed. Just words that found their way naturally, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment to be spoken. There was no pressure, no awkwardness weighing things down. Instead, there was an ease that felt unfamiliar yet comforting, like stepping into a place you had never been before but somehow felt like home. Every sentence seemed to open a small door, revealing pieces of who we were. And with each passing moment, that initial curiosity began to grow into something more meaningful. I found myself paying attention to the smallest details, the tone of her voice, the way she paused before speaking, the softness in her expressions. Time, which usually moves so predictably, began to feel different. It wasn't rushing forward or dragging behind. It was simply there, allowing us to exist in that moment without interruption. And in that space, something quietly began to unfold, something neither of us planned, yet neither of us could ignore. There are moments in life when everything seems to be flowing naturally, when you allow yourself to get lost in the comfort of a connection without questioning it. That's exactly where I was, completely present, completely unaware that a single detail was about to shift the way I saw everything. It came up casually, almost like it didn't matter. Just a simple part of conversation, the kind of thing people share without thinking twice. Her age. At first, I didn't react. Not outwardly. I just paused for a fraction of a second, enough for the thought to settle in. But inside, it was different. Inside, it felt like something had been quietly disrupted. Not because it changed how I felt about her, but because it suddenly introduced a reality I hadn't considered before. Numbers are strange like that. They don't carry emotion, yet they have the power to influence it. They sit there, simple and factual, but the meaning we attach to them can be overwhelming. And in that moment, I wasn't just hearing her age, I was hearing everything that comes with it. Expectations, assumptions, invisible rules that people follow without ever questioning why. My mind started racing in directions my heart hadn't gone. I thought about how others might see it, how quickly people judge things that don't fit into their idea of normal. I could almost hear the unspoken opinions, the raised eyebrows, the quiet conversations that happen behind closed doors. It wasn't happening yet, but it felt inevitable. And that's what made it heavy. Because just seconds before, everything had felt light and effortless. There were no barriers, no calculations, no second thoughts. Just two people talking, connecting, existing in a moment that felt real. But now, something external had entered that space, something that didn't belong to us, yet had the potential to affect us. I looked at her differently, but not in the way you might expect. I wasn't questioning her. I wasn't doubting what I felt. Instead, I was trying to understand why something so simple could suddenly feel so complicated. Why a number, something so small, could carry so much weight in a world that claims to value connection. And in that moment, I realized the conflict wasn't between me and her. It was between my heart and everything I had been taught to believe. The more I allowed myself to feel, the louder the outside world seemed to become, even when no one had said a single word. It was strange how pressure can exist without presence, how judgment can be felt before it is ever spoken. What started as something pure and effortless was now surrounded by invisible questions, and I found myself standing in the middle of two opposing forces. On one side, there was my heart, calm, certain, and unwavering. It didn't see complications, didn't recognize barriers, didn't measure love in numbers or timelines. It simply responded to how she made me feel. Safe, understood, alive in a way that felt rare and honest. On the other side, there was everything else. The expectations I had grown up with. The unspoken rules that society quietly enforces. The idea that some things are acceptable, and others are meant to be questioned. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how this would look, how it would be perceived, how easily people could misunderstand something they never truly experienced. I started imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet. The kind where people don't ask to understand, but to judge. The kind where they reduce something meaningful into something questionable. It wasn't fear of being wrong, it was the weight of being misunderstood. And that weight began to create distance, not between us, but within me. There were moments when I pulled back slightly, not in action, but in thought. I questioned things I hadn't questioned before. I analyzed feelings that once came naturally. I tried to make sense of something that was never meant to be complicated. But every time I drifted into that space, something would pull me back. Her presence. The way she spoke without trying to impress. The way she listened without interrupting. The way she existed without pretending to be anything other than herself. There was a kind of honesty in her that made all the noise outside feel distant, almost irrelevant. And that's when I realized the real battle wasn't about age, or opinions, or acceptance. It was about courage. The courage to trust what I felt, even when it didn't align with what others might expect. The courage to stand in something real, even when it could be misunderstood. The courage to choose connection over comfort, truth over approval. Because the easiest thing would have been to step away, to convince myself that it wasn't worth the complexity, that it was better to stay within the boundaries everyone understands. But nothing about this felt ordinary enough to walk away from. It wasn't one big moment that made everything feel real. It wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic turning point that suddenly defined what we were. Instead, it was a collection of small, almost invisible moments that slowly built something undeniable between us. It was in the way our conversations never felt forced. Hours would pass, and somehow it still felt like we had just begun. There was a rhythm to it, a natural flow where silence didn't feel empty and words didn't feel heavy. We could talk about the simplest things, and yet it carried a depth that was hard to explain. I began to notice how she remembered the smallest details, things I didn't even think were important. A random thought I mentioned in passing, a preference I casually shared, a story I told without expecting it to matter. And then, days later, she would bring it up again, not to impress me, but because she genuinely cared. That kind of attention is rare, the kind that makes you feel seen without asking to be noticed. There were moments when we would laugh, not because something was particularly funny, but because being around each other made everything lighter. It was effortless, unfiltered, real. The kind of laughter that doesn't need a reason, the kind that stays with you even after the moment is gone. And then there were the quiet moments. The ones where words faded into the background, and all that remained was presence. Sitting side by side, not saying much, yet understanding everything. It's in those moments that you realize connection isn't built on constant conversation, but on comfort. On knowing that you don't have to perform, you don't have to fill every silence, you just have to be. I found peace in her presence, a kind of calm I didn't even know I was missing. The world outside could be chaotic, unpredictable, loud, but with her, everything felt steady. Like for a little while, nothing else mattered. She had a way of grounding me without even trying. A way of making me feel understood without asking too many questions. It wasn't about fixing anything or changing anything, it was about accepting things as they were. And somewhere in between all those little moments, without any announcement or realization, something deeper took shape. Not loud enough to demand attention, but strong enough to be felt in everything we did. There comes a point where thinking no longer helps, where questions only create more noise, and where the only thing left to do is choose. Not based on what seems easy, not based on what looks acceptable, but based on what feels undeniably true. I found myself standing at that point, fully aware of everything that could go wrong, fully aware of how complicated things might become. The world hadn't changed, its opinions hadn't softened, and the expectations were still exactly the same. But something inside me had shifted. I stopped asking what others would think. And I started asking myself a different question: what would it cost me to walk away from something that feels this real? Because it's easy to let go when something is uncertain, when feelings are shallow, when the connection isn't strong enough to hold you in place. But this was different. This had depth. This had meaning. This had a quiet strength that didn't need validation to exist. I realized that choosing love isn't always about celebration. Sometimes it's about responsibility. It's about standing by something when it would be easier to step back. It's about protecting a feeling that the world might not understand. There were still moments of hesitation, of course. Moments where doubt tried to return, where the weight of reality pressed against everything I felt. But those moments didn't last the way they used to. They didn't control me the same way. Because every time I looked at her, I saw more than just a situation I had to justify. I saw a person who had become important to me in ways I never expected. Someone who brought honesty into my life, who made things feel simple in a world that often feels complicated. Someone who didn't ask me to change, didn't demand explanations, didn't turn love into something conditional. And that clarity made the choice easier. Not easy, but clear. I chose to stay. I chose to accept everything that came with it, the questions, the opinions, the uncertainty. Not because I had all the answers, but because I no longer needed them. Love, in its truest form, isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting what you feel even when the path isn't perfectly defined. It's about holding on, not out of fear of losing, but out of certainty that what you have is worth keeping. And in that choice, I found a kind of strength I didn't know I had, a quiet determination to stand by something that felt real, even if it meant standing against everything else.